Let me move on and walk through a theoretical example to illustrate how some of all this might work together out on a site. So here's our theoretical parcel of land. So the parcel is about 3.2 hectares in size, or just shy of 32,000 square meters. And let's say for this parcel that the OPA says that it's urban core. It's got a, which you can get from Schedule L1, it's got a maximum density of 6 FSI, which we get from Schedule L2, and a minimum density of 3 FSI, which we get from Schedule L3. I may have those backwards, actually, but. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, FSI stands for Floor Space Index. Essentially what this means is that a floor space index of 6 represents 6 times the size of the parcel. So this is like stacking the parcel on top of each other 6 times. And since we know the size of the parcel itself, we simply multiply that number by 6, and we can calculate the most amount of floor space that a development could have on this site, which in this case is just under 192,000 square meters. Similarly, when a minimum FSI of 3 is like stacking 3 of them on top of each other, we multiply by 3, and we now have the minimum amount of floor space that we need to develop on the site. So of course, we don't want to develop a massive 3-story building that encompasses the entire site, and there are other things that we need to consider. In this example, let's say our schedules are showing a conceptual park proposed for the site. We also see on Schedule L5, the transportation network, that there's a proposed street network that needs to be incorporated around and through our site, both in the form of widenings or a new street, say running through the middle of the site. This area together represents land that needs to be conveyed to the town before construction of a new development can proceed. And then also looking at the active transportation schedule, which is Schedule L6, we see that there is an off-road active transportation connection identified through our site. And while the landowner does not need to convey land to the town for this connection, it does need to be accounted for in the design of the site. So now we can start laying out buildings on our site. So in this example, we've gone with a perimeter block concept where the buildings front the public streets, and we create some semi-private space on the interior. And we break up the buildings along the frontages to allow access from the street into these spaces. And these spaces can be used for privately owned public space or POPs. It could be possibly back of house functions, or for mid-block connections like the one identified by the dashed green line in the OPA. And here's an example of where the town's urban design directions, and this is just an example, there are many of them, to help inform this design. So, which requires that 15-meter spacing between buildings, so we ensure that the breaks that we're putting in are at least this wide. So then using these footprints, we've determined that we need, on this site specifically, we need mid-rise buildings that are at least 8 to 9 stories in height to achieve the minimum required density. Again, this represents the minimum amount of development we would need on this site to meet the minimum FSI. And you can see that the GFA of the concept shown is just slightly larger than the minimum GFA we calculated earlier. And I will point out we have represented green roofs on these buildings by coloring the roof green, but it's to represent that there are standards in terms of sustainability that we would also incorporate into these buildings, such as geothermal, potentially, that was talked about earlier. So the proposed policies, as Sibel has mentioned, indicate that a number of streets need to contain active frontages and retail frontage. So we've just added that in and illustrated that a little bit with some wider sidewalks and street trees within the right-of-way. And now let's look at the built form that could result by developing this site to the maximum density. So this is the minimum density. What could we do if we used the same and got to the maximum FSI? Something I think we need to keep in mind is that the town's urban design direction for buildings greater than 12 stories restrict the floor plate size. And then they also say the podiums or the base can be no higher than approximately 6 stories. So pay particular attention to what happens on this local street in the middle. Currently, it has 8 stories on either side, and this could go up to 12 stories, which is the maximum for a mid-rise building in the town's urban design direction. So this requirement does mean that we get a podium tower type of building when you start to get into these higher gross floor areas. And so this concept shows one way that the site could be developed. In this example, we end up with 7 towers, and the resulting building heights range from 24 stories to 35 stories. I think what this regime does is it tries to incent a development to keep as much of the development as they can kind of under that building threshold, so that when they do go above that threshold, it's because they're required to provide additional community benefit on top of it, so it becomes a transaction at that point. So there is a little bit of an incentive to not go too tall with one building and keep the others lower, and try and balance the development across the site. So the GFA concept shown here is just a little bit less than the maximum. And so this shows that it doesn't exceed the maximum density. So a few other things I'll highlight here is that each tower is separated from each other by at least 35 meters here. But like I said, some of them, if you're below 25 stories, it can be go down to 30-meter separation. And this is where a tower could be stepped back to increase that separation on the higher heights. And as you can see again on that street in the middle that I was talking about earlier, now we only have 6 stories actually close to the street because the policies also call for a minimum 5-meter step back at that podium height. And what this does is help to reduce the impact of taller buildings at the street level, allow more sunlight to penetrate, for example, and really allow sunlight to hit some of those open spaces and public streets a little more. Finally, let's look at what the building threshold, how applying the building threshold, what it would do to this site. So on our theoretical site, we have a building threshold of 20 stories. So the floors highlighted in the orange color represent the floor space above the building height threshold. And again, through a CPPS, the developer would then need to provide additional community benefit, either cash in lieu or an in-kind benefit, to be able to build the additional, we've calculated it out here, just over 50,000 square meters of floor space above the building height threshold. So this is about the equivalent to about 1.5 FSI on this site, or about 5 hectares of land if you took that floor space and spread it out flat on the ground. So it's important to note that the proportion of development that may be subject to a community benefit will be different from site to site and dependent on how the development applicant chooses to use the range of GFA they are provided in the min and max density allocations. And it's also important to note that the benefit will be commensurate with the additional gross floor area, not measured by the number of stories. So it's based on how much floor area you're providing, not necessarily the number of stories that you're going above. In terms of the community benefits, there's a long list of facilities, services, and matters that could be provided in exchange for exceeding the threshold heights. These are ones that are already established within the Livable Oakville Plan as part of the Section 37 bonusing, and these would continue to apply in this case. And then the Midtown OPA as well has other specific benefits to Midtown that could also be part of the negotiation. And this includes things that we've already talked about, like parkland, improvement to parks, affordable housing, green buildings, and other things. So, as Sibel mentioned earlier, this OPA sets the stage for a CPPS, and through that system, the town is able to implement the policies of the OP when approving a development permit to address all the external matters of a site and ensure that the public realm is provided and designed appropriately. And there's a lot of detail on the slide that you can read, but it allows, there's some flexibility and discretion, as Sibel has already mentioned, within that as well, that can be used and when developing the CPP bylaw to allow for some minor variations as council may decide to permit through that. So now I'll move on to what I know is also a topic of interest, and that's yields and some of the overall concepts. So this slide is the bonus slide. And hopefully it gives a little more information, but it may, again, I acknowledge it may not give all the detail that, say, Councillor Adams and others might be looking for, but it really talks about how we go from the gross floor area that we showed in the theoretical example and how we can determine people and jobs and how it's estimated from this gross floor area. So we start with our total GFA. Right off the top, we'll allocate 15% of that GFA towards common areas, and this would be lobbies, hallways, stairwells, mechanical rooms, and other things. This is another way of describing this as a building efficiency factor in terms of you can't allocate all of the GFA to units themselves because there are these common spaces and functional spaces that are needed to make a building work. And this does not result in any residents or jobs. So we've talked about the 18% office and retail area, or the non-residential uses. So 18% of that GFA, according to that policy, gets attributed to non-residential uses. And then the remainder, which would be about 67%, is allocated to residential units. In terms of the office retail area, we've applied assumption of about 30 square meters per employee. I will say that this is smaller than historically some of the numbers have shown, like say in the DC background study, which have numbers that are saying existing space in certain uses, say for example 37 square meters. But we're feeling because this is an urban context, it may be the amount of space needed for each employee might be less than we might be seeing currently, and heading in that direction, we're seeing that the space used up by an employee is starting to get smaller, particularly in some of these urbanized spaces. So we have used the assumption of 30 square meters per employee to account for the jobs that would be created through the retail at the ground floor, through some offices, and maybe potentially some places that provide common workspace areas for those that are working at home as a business, for example, that we've seen. So if you use that assumption, in this theoretical example, we have 1,147 estimated jobs. So similar for the residential side of it, we're using an assumption of 50 square meters per resident. And this assumption incorporates a number of factors that we've been talking about in terms of the unit mix, how many large units, how many small units, what are the size of those units, and then how many people per unit are we seeing in those respective sizes. So we have used, for example, in one way to develop this, or to verify that the 50 square meters is a fair assumption, we've incorporated PPUs from our DC background study, unit mixes similar to requiring a 35%, 65%, as well as using average unit sizes that we have in some of the studies, say for example in the hospital district, and using those, it verifies that 50 square meters per resident is a reasonable number to use, and so that's the assumption that we've used in these calculations, and in this case, that would result in 2,561 residents, and of course you combine those, you get just over 3,700 estimated people and jobs in this theoretical example. So when you do this exercise for all the various blocks within Midtown using similar assumptions, we can estimate possible resident and job yields in all of Midtown. And this is if, so for example, the top line is at the minimum FSI. So if every parcel in Midtown developed only at the minimum, we estimate that we would result in 25,325 people and jobs in Midtown. So it is essentially just over the minimum. If everybody developed at the minimum, and we know development of all the property in Midtown would take a very long time, we are still confident that even if everybody came in at the minimum, we would be meeting our minimum target of, I think, 20,000 people and jobs. In terms of, at the bottom line, we have our maximum FSI. And so when you apply the algorithm that I just talked about to that, we estimate that you get just under 53,000 people and jobs across Midtown. Again, realize this is a theoretical number if all of the property in Midtown maximized to the fullest potential their community benefit to reach the maximum FSI. That's the upper number that you could get. So then, of course, that begs the question, well, what if nobody took advantage of this threshold and went above the threshold? If everybody did that and developed as far high as they could up to that, that threshold height, what would we get? And we estimate that would be about 50,500 people and jobs in Midtown. So there's a difference there of about 126,000 square meters. And this, and it would be, this is, sorry, I'm just lost my space here. So this would be the amount of floor space that the town would have an opportunity to negotiate for additional community benefits that we've been talking about. But it's through the development of the CPP bylaw that we would need to determine what the value of that GFA would be and how it translates into a community benefit that's commensurate with the amount of GFA that's getting provided. So to conclude this segment of the presentation, here's an illustration of our massing model for Midtown, where all the development is either at or below the height thresholds. So all of these buildings are at 20 stories, 12, or 10 stories based on the building threshold schedule that have been assigned to it. And in this illustration, the maximum site density for all sites is not achieved. This is just where they would get if they built right to the threshold. In this illustration, we show a possible scenario where site density is at or near the maximum allocated. So this is that in theory, if everybody developed to that maximum GFA, this is where we would end up, or it's one way that we could end up there. The tallest building in this scenario is 45 stories. So this height is a product of implementing the various design and built form policies, as well as the maximum density. And it does account for lands that would be dedicated for public purposes, such as parks and roads. So the total GFA that is attributed to the orange areas would be granted only on the condition that commensurate community benefits in cash or in kind are provided. And again, we've talked about what these community benefits could include. But the actual community benefit will be determined through the development permit approval process. And I'm sure we've generated even more questions that we'd be happy to answer at this point.